Briahna, what's on your radar?
Are words weapons of mass destruction? Well, acclaimed liberal author of White Teeth, Zadie Smith, argued as much in a recent piece for The New Yorker. That was roundly skewered by pro-Palestine voices over the weekend. Why? Well, although the piece was broadly sympathetic to the plight of Palestinians, it arguably engaged in a kind of bothsiderism that chastised anti-war college protesters for insufficiently respecting the safety concerns of Jewish students on campus, even as bombs are killing Palestinian students' relatives in real time. In Smith's words, "When I open newspapers and see students dismissing the idea that some of their fellow students feel at this particular moment unsafe on campus, or arguing that such a feeling is simply not worth attending to, given the magnitude of what's occurring in Gaza, I find such sentiments cynical and unworthy of this movement." Smith specifically calls to mind a hypothetical Jewish student who finds herself referred to as a Zionist, and Smith wonders whether, in the context of a campus, if that student might be the weakest, most vulnerable person in the social dynamic, and whether that makes them deserving of having their safety prioritized. First, I'd like to point out that in this hypothetical, the Zionist student objectively isn't the most vulnerable party. Physical violence has not been inflicted against pro-Israeli college kids yet. 3 Palestinian American students have been shot, 1 paralyzed, and a mob of 100 pro-Zionist counter-protesters physically attacked peaceful pro-Palestine students last week at UCLA with tear gas, bear mace, wooden planks, fireworks, and hammers. One female reporter for the school paper says she was repeatedly punched by a male pro-Israel counter-protester. 25 pro-Palestine protesters were hospitalized overnight. No arrests have been made. But ignoring the material reality of these protests and what's happening in the Middle East is why so many of these pundits are getting it so wrong. Zadie errs in making the same mistake so many conservatives make as they try to characterize or mischaracterize why leftists care about anything or anyone other than themselves. They seem unable to understand that tens of thousands of people have been killed, and most of us find it heartbreaking and want it to stop, rather than keep funding it. It's as simple as that. But the truth is too inconvenient for conservatives like, say, Christopher Rufo, who support Israel but have to make sense of the asymmetry of death and destruction in the region that is disproportionately borne by Palestinians. To do that, Rufo has popularized framing the left's interest in equality, be it racial equality, gender equality, or equality for Arabs living in historic Palestine, as reflective of an ethos which sees everyone as either oppressed or oppressor. Rufo argues that these categories are mapped unfairly onto racial categories of people like black and white or Israeli and Palestinian, and that they serve as a kind of totalizing identity politics that lacks nuance and causes people to prejudge those in the oppressor group in a sort of reverse racism. But even in Zadie Smith's hypothetical, the criticism is not of the Jewish student's religion, but of her politics. Her commitment to Zionism as a political project is what's under scrutiny here, even in Zadie's own hypothetical. As much as Congress wants to make it so, anti-Zionism is not, in fact, anti-Semitism. And the politics of Zionism are ripe for critique. Palestinians are not abstract oppressed parties or victims in this scenario. They are quite literally being victimized by dumb bombs, drones, and sniper fire. Are we allowed to call a child a victim when he's been orphaned by the Israeli state? Isn't it oppression to be forced to live in an occupied 25-mile territory for 75 years? What does Rufo have to say when the oppressor isn't an abstract category, but an American-backed army that's pledged to turn Gaza into a parking lot, seemingly no matter how many dead children it takes? If it's woke to point out an obvious power dynamic, how can you ever fight for equality? And here we get to Rufo's goal and the trap Zadie Smith has fallen into. At the start of her piece, Smith says she, quote, understands the ethics underpinning the protest to be based on 2 widely recognized principles. 1, that there is an ethical duty to express solidarity with the weak in any situation that involves oppressive power. And 2, If the machinery of oppressive power is to be trained on the weak, then there is a duty to stop the gears by any means necessary. But what both Smith and Rufo-style conservatives miss is that there is no conspiracy to place people in certain artificial categories here. The goal is not to protect the weak. What does that even mean? The goal is to stop a genocide. What people are responding to, what protesters are motivated by, is real. It's what we call material. Whether you call them oppressed or weak, the fact is that 34,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel over the last 7 months in Gaza. 3/4 of those killed have been women and children. The UN Food Program chief says there is full-blown famine in northern Gaza making its way south. There are 17,000 orphans in Gaza. More than 70% of all housing in Gaza has been destroyed. A new UN report estimates it would take 80 years to rebuild them all. And of course, you cannot bring back the dead. A majority of Americans want a ceasefire, and college kids, including young Jews, more of whom are more sympathetic to Palestine than Israel. An October YouGov poll found that more people aged 18 to 29 sympathize with Palestinians than Israelis in the current conflict. They are protesting not because of some academic notion of who is oppressed or weak, but because human beings are being killed. Oppression is an action that's being carried out by an Israeli apartheid state, the leader of whom just yesterday rejected a ceasefire and hostage deal because it would force him to stop his siege on Gaza, something he pledges will not end until Hamas is eliminated, an outcome his own military intelligence says is an impossibility. To tens of thousands of college students and millions of people across the world, compassion for Palestinians comes not from their academic status as victims, but from the fact that they are being victimized and with American tax dollars and bombs. Framing the issue as a kind of oppression identity Olympics enables those who support Israel to pretend that those who do not share their sympathies are acting irrationally, following some unfair and reductive categorization of Jews as oppressors. Alternatively, that those sympathetic with Palestine are simply anti-Semitic. If the reasoning of Palestine supporters is seen as irrational, reductive, or bigoted, well, they can be ignored. And this is why you get so many people proposing various explanations of why so many people care about Palestine that avoid the most obvious answer. It's because they're human beings, and it breaks our hearts to see them slaughtered, tortured, and starved. But Zadie Smith seems to struggle with this. She asked the audience to consider whether it's fair for a pro-Palestine student to call a Jewish student a Zionist without once considering whether the Jewish student is in fact a Zionist, or whether the student describing her as such is themselves Jewish, as so many pro-Palestine protesters are. Is the student called Zionist uncomfortable because they've been mislabeled? If so, that's fair. Or alternatively, have they been accurately identified as supporters of a Jewish ethno-state? Have they been unfairly judged, or are they just uncomfortable with the reality that the Overton window is shifting and more people are rejecting the Zionist project, which required and continues to require the violent ethnic cleansing of the Arab demographic majority from the region? If being called Zionist creates cognitive dissonance in the young Zionist student, well, congratulations. It just might be that she has a conscience, telling her to examine whether the narrative she was sold as a youngster about her entitlement to a land on the other side of the world from her own campus is justified on the basis of her religion, when her classmates' relatives have been killed in the dozens so that she might have a right of return to a land she may never have even visited. A student experiencing this cognitive dissonance isn't feeling unsafe, they're feeling guilty. And the solution could be to abandon her commitment to Zionism. The alternative is to abandon her conscience. Smith frames the debate as genocidal on both sides. She writes, Hamas will not be eliminated, but also the more than 7 million Jewish human beings who live in the gap between the river and the sea will not simply vanish because you think that they should. Well, of course, Jews being disappeared from Israel is not the goal. The end to apartheid is the goal. An equal state where one religion is not established over the others is the goal. Palestinians being granted the right to return to their homeland after subsisting for 75 years as refugees is the goal. A goal that is only being thwarted by Israel's commitment to being a specifically Jewish ethno-state and maintaining the demographic balance necessary to ensure religious dominance. As such, the desires of Zionist students and anti-Zionist students do not carry equal moral weight. You can't both sides a fight for equality where one side wants to deny it to the other, even if they say they're doing it, because God instructs it to be so. This conversation is painful for the anti-war protesters, in part because the concern for Jewish safety in the abstract is repeatedly weighted against the real, material, visceral threats to Palestinian life, 34,000 and counting. And time again, Jewish people who simply feel unsafe become the locus of concern. As Zadie Smith put it, in the case of Israel-Palestine, language and rhetoric are and always have been weapons of mass destruction. But language and rhetoric didn't kill Hind Rajab and her family. It didn't murder the Jose Andres aid workers. It didn't flatten every university in Gaza or dig up 16 grave sites there. Belief that Palestinians should be cleared from the land and stripped of any incentive to return did that. How else do you explain digging up a graveyard other than to permanently cut ties between a people and their past? I wanted to get, and have been wanting for a while, to get to the core of this issue. People repeatedly ask, well, how do you want to resolve this? It's the question that's frequently put to pro-peace protesters. And over again, we're told this situation is so complex. It's so complex. That's why it's been going on for so long. This is a millennia-long struggle. It's so complex. I think it's not complex. And people try to inject complexity, whether it's the Post saying it's because the kids aren't having enough sex, whether it's people saying, like Rufo saying, well, you only think that Palestinians need to be protected because you see everything as oppressor and oppressee, and because Jews are white and Arabs aren't, that's why you're siding with Palestinians. It's not because of anything real that's happening in the world. There's something very real happening in the world, and real people are dying in the world. And the question of what can be done all comes down to, in my view, whether or not the rights that Palestinians deserve can be restored. And fundamentally, they cannot be if you are committed to the idea that demographically, in that region in the world, there has to be a Jewish majority. That is how you get Palestinians never being allowed to have a right to return, because that would threaten that Jewish majority. And I understand that there are people who feel very deeply about this issue and are never going to agree with the idea that there should not be a Jewish state. But I would put forward that a state that's safe for Jewish people, much like I would argue the United States of America, with the second largest Jewish population in the world, is more important than creating a dynamic where Jews are increasingly targeted because of the state of Israel's choice to deny basic rights or freedom to the Palestinian people.
I mean, we're very far apart on this. I agree that I think it would be best for the U.S. to disentangle itself from this conflict entirely, because unlike you, I do think it's incredibly complicated, and I don't think we're improving the situation. I don't think we have any ability to improve the situation. We can invite attacks on ourselves, on our own forces, on our bases by being more involved, and we should, to whatever extent possible, disentangle ourselves from Europe, from the Middle East, etc. But you say it's not complicated, but it is complicated now because the region in question, Gaza, is governed by a terrorist group that attacked Israel and that has pledged to do so again and again and again. So their fear is that until that group is totally and utterly defeated or surrenders, there can be no peace with the people of the region. And the people of the region are, in fact, victims and war victims, and it's awful what's happening to them. But simply allowing Hamas to keep going is not something the Jewish leadership is willing to do. So it has come to this.
Well, Hamas wouldn't exist if there weren't a Jewish state.
A lot of things could be done differently, but here we are now.
Well, here we are now. But the long ago of things that have been done differently doesn't feel very long ago. When you're someone who has the keys to a house that your family lived in for generations, that is now occupied by someone who is an immigrant from Europe or from America, who has a right because of what their religion is and what their ethnicity is to move to a country that you are fundamentally denied from moving to. This is not a state that was created. But wait a minute. This is not a state that was created that said, all right, Jews are welcome. Everybody can move here. This is great. This was a state that was created that said, Jews can move here. These other people have to be ethnically cleansed from the land, and you were never allowed to return. And that is the fundamental sin. That is the original sin. And if you want this to end, if you want to actually defeat Hamas, it is getting to the core of what Palestinians, including Hamas, have been fighting for, which is to have those rights returned to them. That's it. That's the answer to the question. If you don't like that answer, you can say, we have to have a Jewish state, and Palestinians are never going to be allowed to come back here, and you're signing up for infinitely more fighting, or a kind of a final solution where the Palestinians are finally killed and wiped off the earth. And that's what many people think is what's going on in Gaza right now, a permanent ratcheting up of this ethnic cleansing that's been going on for 75 years that might become permanent if they're all killed and expelled from the region.
The organization, the quasi-government organization they're fighting against has not surrendered yet. And if they're willing to go forward with this until they are utterly defeated, then that's just what they're willing to do. And it's like our projection onto them that, well, you should stop this. Well, they don't want to. And the leadership of the Gaza Strip wants to keep fighting Israel until it's gone. So here we are. But I agree with you that we should not be involved. And the part of your radar focused on the protests themselves and how they're characterized in words as violence. I did read that essay, and like you, I don't think criticism of Israel should be always read as anti-Semitism. I think often it's clearly not anti-Semitism. I certainly don't think it should be codified into law as a kind of anti-Semitism, something that people, including Christopher Rufo, have pushed back on. Christopher Rufo wrote an op-ed for Bari Weiss's Substack, for the Free Press, co-written with Jenin Younes, who is who is, I think, of Palestinian descent herself and is kind of a left-leaning civil libertarian person. And they had a great co-written piece about how this new Anti-Semitism Awareness Act will absolutely be bad for the cause of free speech on first principles. So I encourage people to check that out. More Rising right after this.